Fame and Fortune Weekly, Stories of Boys Who Make Money, Number 6, November 10th, 1905, published by Frank Tousey. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Building a Railroad, or The Young Contractors of Lakeview, by a Self-Made Man. Recording by Keith Salis. Chapter 1. The Railroad Contract. "Well, Don," said Gil Winthrop, a bright-eyed, earnest-looking lad of 18 years, as his twin brother Donald entered the office of John Winthrop, General Contractor, on Main Street, in the town of Lakeview. "Does the contract stand?" There was a shade of anxiety in his voice, while his hazel eyes searched his brother's face as if he would read the answer in his expressive features. "Yes, Gil," replied Don in cheery tones. "Everything is satisfactorily arranged. Mr. Prescott, the chief engineer of the DP&Q, assured me that the original bond is holding on the work, and so far as the railroad company is concerned, Father's death will make no difference with respect to the contract." "Good!" exclaimed Gil with sparkling eyes. "Andrew Newman was present, and he made a big fight to freeze us out. He said all manner of uncomplimentary things about you and I, but it did not do him any good just the same." "I'm glad the matter is settled, Don," said Gil, with an air of relief. "I was afraid that Newman would get the inside track of us. He's an old, experienced contractor, you know. He expected to get this contract in the first place, and was as mad as a hornet when it was awarded to Father. The day it was signed, Jim Kelso, Newman's confidential foreman, who was under the influence of liquor at the time, swore that Father never would complete the work within the stipulated time. Do you think we may look for trouble from the Newman crowd? It is quite possible they would try to annoy us all they can. We must be on our guard. It is up to us, Gil, to build the road within the time limit, not only for the honor of the thing, but to save forfeiture of the security bond, which you are aware amounts to 20% of the approximate cost of the contract. No excuses for the non-fulfillment of agreement will go with the railroad company." Don walked over to the safe, took therefrom the blueprints and a copy of the general specifications for building the line of road covered by the contract. The two boys sat down to a table with a pile of memoranda prepared by their father before he died. They were soon engrossed in the study of the situation. The late John Winthrop had contracted to build a branch line for the DP&Q Railroad from Lakeview to the main line at Glendale, a distance of about 20 miles. As this was not the first contract of the kind he had undertaken, he was well provided with the necessary facilities for the prosecution of such work. His steam shovel outfit had a capacity of 2,500 cubic yards in 10 hours, and it handled all kinds of material, from the softest earth to shale rock, large boulders, tree stumps, etc., and performed all the work of loosening and loading. As the economical working of the shovel required that the material should be hauled away as fast as it was loaded, Mr. Winthrop had provided some 30 dirt cars, which, when the distance to the dump was short, was hauled by horses. Otherwise, they were made up in 2 trains and handled by a couple of narrow-gauge locomotives. The steam shovel was indispensable in the present job, as the survey carried the line through a spur of the foothills, where a cut half a mile or more long would have to be excavated. A short tunnel had to be cut through a cliff projecting into the lake, but by far the greater part of the roadbed would lie along a flat, comparatively level district bordering on the lake, which gave its name to the town with which the railroad connection was to be made. The arm of this body of water ran close to the spur of the hill where the principal excavation was to be made, and Mr. Winthrop counted on this as a great advantage to him, as the 50-horsepower non-condensing engine employed to operate the steam shovel used so much water that the cost of water supply, which was a serious matter to him when water was not readily obtainable, was reduced to a minimum. John Winthrop had only one competitor for the railroad contract. This was Andrew Newman, a man by no means popular in that neighborhood, where he had done a great deal of road building for the county. Newman wanted this particular contract badly, and he tried his level best to get it, making use of questionable methods, but possession of the proper plant enabled Winthrop to underbid him, and Newman felt very bitter toward his successful rival. Winthrop had got things almost in shape for beginning the work, when one morning he was found dead in his chair in his private office. The physician called in declared that he had died of heart failure. The case, therefore, did not go to the coroner, and in due time all that was mortal of John Winthrop was laid away in the town burying ground. A few days after the funeral, Newman called on Mrs. Winthrop and made her an offer for the business and plant as it stood, which of course carried with it the railroad contract. The offer was not at all satisfactory. Besides, her two stalwart sons, Donald and Guilford, had determined to carry on their father's business. They believed themselves fully competent to do so. Both had taken a 3 years course in civil engineering, and in addition thereto had 2 years practical experience under their father's eye, for Mr. Winthrop's intention had been to eventually take his boys into partnership. With a valuable contract at their disposal and all the necessary means at hand to carry out the work outlined, it would have been a foolish move to dispose of the business even at a fair price, and Mr. Newman's offer could scarcely have been called a fair one. He believed the Winthrop business was at his mercy. For Don and Gil he had nothing but contempt. He looked on them merely as boys. Not for a moment did he believe that they would attempt to carry out the contract for grading the 20 miles of roadbed between Lakeview and Glendale. He was unpleasantly surprised when he discovered that such was really their intention. "Ridiculous!" he exclaimed to his man Kelso, and his chief assistant, of course, agreed that the idea was preposterous. "I shall see the chief engineer of the D.P.&Q. about it," he said angrily, and he did. He found Don Winthrop in consultation with Mr. Prescott. He was admitted to the conference, and he used every argument in his power to convince the engineer that it would be folly to allow the Winthrop estate to carry on the contract with two such boys as Don and Gil in charge. But Mr. Prescott had the records of the young fellows before him, and he saw no reason why the contract should not stand. The boys were fully prepared and apparently qualified to carry out the work, and the surety bond was good. So Andrew Newman was disappointed in his effort to attain the object sought after. The contract was to stand, and he was out of it. We are sorry to say that the big contractor used some very strong language to relieve his feelings after he left the engineer's office. If he had been disgruntled by losing the contract originally to John Winthrop, he was twice as much put out to be euchred by that gentleman's sons. "I'll get square with those cubs for daring to beard me to my face. So they think they can build this branch line, do they?" He laughed sardonically as he walked along the street toward his own office. "They think they can do the work on time, eh? With a half-mile spur to be cut through the hills and a tunnel at the cliff to blast out. Oh, yes, they'll do it. Not if Andrew Newman knows it, they won't, and I guess he'll keep track of what they do. I swore their father shouldn't make a success of this work, and I meant it. I guess he was a bigger proposition than they are." He stopped at the saloon to get a drink, a frequent habit of his, and found his confidential foreman, Jim Kelso, lined up with a couple of cronies against the bar. Jim was not in the least abashed when his boss surprised him in his position. Kelso had a habit of doing pretty much as he pleased when business was not rushing, and Andrew Newman's affairs were somewhat slack just then. He had only one contract on hand. It was a matter of road building on the other side of the lake, and Kelso's assistant, Mike Mullen, was looking after that. Newman called for a whiskey, and having drank it, he motioned Kelso to follow him outside. "The railroad contract has been transferred to those boys, in spite of everything I could do to the contrary," said Newman gloweringly. "Has it?" replied Kelso with an unpleasant grin. "They've got a cast-iron nerve to think they'll be able to put such an undertaking through in anything like the time stipulated. Failure to do it will cost them a pretty penny, I'm thinking," said Kelso with another of his cheerful grins. "Maybe they will, but I reckon we ought to help 'em along in that direction. They won't need any assistance. I'm willing to bet $1,000 that they'll be all tangled up in less than a month." "Don't be so sure of that, Mr. Newman," answered the foreman with a sage wag of his head. "Them boys understand their business." "Who says they do?" demanded the contractor angrily. "I say so. If you want to know my opinion, it's just this. Them two lads are smarter than chain lightning." "What are you giving me, Jim Kelso?" growled Mr. Newman with a lowering brow. "Nothing that I can't prove. If you want to do them two boys up, you've got to get right down to business. You don't want to take no chances. They may have bitten off more than they can chew with this railroad job, but You'll be kinder surprised, mark my words, to see how way they'll go at it. Them boys ain't no kid-glove dudes. You'd know it by this time if you'd paid any attention to 'em, which I guess you haven't." This plain statement on the part of his foreman was news, and not pleasant news, to Andrew Newman. He wanted to discredit it, for he despised everything that bore the name of Winthrop, but he was keen enough to understand that there must be some ground for Kelso's dogged assertion. "Your word is pretty good, Jim, but I'd like something more substantial in the way of evidence. You watch them boys after they get started on this job of grading, and you'll have all the evidence you want," said his foreman with a nod that carried a great deal of weight with it. "Well," grunted Newman, "I don't care how smart they are. I'm going to pickle 'em. I'm going to drive them out of business in these parts at any rate. I'll bust them higher than a kite before I get through with them. They'll regret the day they measured strength with Andrew Newman. Now you're talking. And you can depend on me helping you to do it. I'm down on that fellow Don. He butted in between my son Jerry and that there gal of mine, who thinks 'cause she's blind she can do as she pleases. But I reckon I won't stand no such nonsense. Where'd you come to get a hold of that girl, Jim? She isn't your daughter." "Never mind how I come to get her. I ain't telling everything I know. She belongs to me, and that's enough said," retorted Kelso doggedly. "Well, it's none of my business. Your affairs are your own. So long as you stand by me, I'm your friend. If you hate one of the Winthrop cubs, so much the better. You'll take a greater relish in doing them up, and the worse they're done up, the more satisfied I'll feel. Come into the office, and we'll go over the matter and see how we'll go to work about the thing." And thus, while Don Winthrop and his brother were arranging the final details for starting the grading of the railroad right-of-way, Andrew Newman and his assistant Jim Kelso were putting their heads together 3 blocks away, laying plans to defeat the efforts of the 2 bright young fellows to carry the work to a successful end. End of Chapter 1.